Hi, I'm Jeff Schoep, and this is Beyond Barriers podcast. We're back again with another season, and our special guest today is Josh Cohen. Welcome to the program, Josh.
Oh, thanks, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always great to see you, and I appreciate you having me on.
Thank you for coming. Hey, for a little bit of background on the for our listeners, can you tell us about? I know you've got a new book out here at today, and here's for the readers. This is William F. Buckley's Guide to Friendship in the Polarized Era by Josh Cohen. Could you tell us a little bit about your background and before we get into the book, just who you are and a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So, my name is Josh Cohen. I am a writer with a rather unforgiving conservative bent, living out in the Minnesota area. I've written for a number of conservative news outlets, and I've been interested for some time in William F. Buckley Jr., and we can get into who he is shortly. Suffice it to say, he's a very um, uh, well-known conservative icon who's been making his name for decades and has been written about endlessly, and someone I've been wanting to tackle for a very long time. Um, Aside from that, I have, as you well know, a podcast called Eyewitness History, where I interview people that were eyewitnesses to historical events. You yourself were a guest on it, as was your friend, our mutual friend, I suppose. Hopefully, I can call him that, Daryl Davis. And I'm looking forward to getting that episode up and live as well. And it's been wonderful. It's been great being able to track through all that. And yeah, that's a little background of who I am.
Fantastic. So, I was going to ask you now, what was it that inspired you to write a book on William Buckley and a little bit about his background?
Yeah, absolutely. I should probably start, Jeff, not assuming that everyone knows who William F. Buckley Jr. is. So I'll give a little
Yes.
background on who he was as a person. So William F. Buckley Jr. was the spearhead of the new conservative movement that began in the mid 1950s and persists through to today, though we may probably agree, and that's rather devolved and somewhat mutated form now. Um, but he ran for a long time. He started and founded a well-known conservative news outlet called National Review, which is still around today. And still considered a bastion of conservative thought. I would say probably his most lasting legacy, with regards to his public persona, his public image, is a show he created called Firing Line, which was on public access, holds the unique distinction of being the longest running public affairs program by a single host, ever. It ran for, I think, around 34 years. And on it, it's sort of a progenitor to the podcast long form format, if you like. So he interviewed people that were generally ideologically opposed to him, which is to say lefties or liberals, generally, not always. And they would go back and forth on a particular topic for an hour, and it could be anything as far as liberal bias in the media. Politics is nothing if not redundant, right? Apartheid in South Africa. He once had the Prime Minister of South Africa on to discuss. I could go on, believe me. And what enticed me to want to write about him, I've been wanting to write about Buckley for a very long time because he was just a very, very interesting person to me. Um, but he's been done to death. I mean, he himself has two autobiographies to give you an idea of the scope and depth in which he's been written on and about. Uh, So when I was thinking through an angle, I wanted to write about his relationships because he knew everyone from far lefties like Christopher Hitchens, about whom I have a chapter, as you know, and then onwards to Henry Kissinger, who you couldn't get more, or Richard Nixon or Ronald Reagan. You couldn't get more conservative than them. Um, I decided finally to settle on an angle of setting his friendships against the backdrop of our hyper-polarized society. And to give a little more texture to that, a lot, though he was this, serious conservative figure and icon, he held friendships with many, 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 many liberals. I would venture to say probably more, he had more liberal friends than conservative friends, if you really want to know the truth. People like J.K. Galbraith, Allard Lowenstein, Murray Kempton, Christopher Hitchens, who I have to a lesser extent, as I have chapters on all of them. And when I was thinking through how best to sort of package this whole thing up, I thought it made sense to explore his relationships and then pull out of each of those friendships a value that could be easily assimilable at scale in today's society. So, for instance, I have, values like gratitude, forgiveness, staving off fanaticism, which I dwell upon in some detail in the book. Um, and hopefully setting out something like a blueprint or a map to elevating our discourse, elevating our standing among each other, and recalling that politics isn't all there is to life, and it's okay to disagree, as I've said on other podcasts, without being disagreeable. So sorry for the long burst there, Jeff, but since you asked, that's my answer.
No, it's great. It's great. And I think, I was going to ask you too, and I want to dive more into the book and the polarization aspect. And I think that's a fantastic insight. But before we do that, I want to ask you, because this is something I think that'll pop out to a lot of people. Is the foreword was written by Oliver North, and for some people, he's kind of a controversial figure, but he's definitely a name that people will know and that stands out. And so explain how that all came about, because I'm curious to hear that as well.
Yeah, Oliver North, God save me. Who'd have guessed? Oliver North, to keep it extremely brief for people that, on the off chance they might not know who he is, himself a very well-known conservative figure, was once the president of the NRA, actually. The reason his name may be most well known to history is because of his implication in the infamous Iran-Contra scandal and the subsequent congressional hearings, which took place as well. He was forefront in many of those. Um, well, how I got involved with Oliver North, the Colonel, is I interviewed him. When I was with Salem Media, I had the opportunity to interview him for Town Hall, about which I've written an article and have an interview. He himself wrote a book about Marxist sentiment on college campuses, which was called American Gulags, and I actually cite that in some detail in the book, in the chapter dealing with modern academia. Uh, and he basically, that was how that relationship started, and he has a relationship with my publisher, Fidelis Publishing, the people that did the book. And I asked my publisher, what do we think about potentially reaching out to the good colonel on this? Because, not only would he have his own insights, and certainly having his name attached to the book would be not the worst thing in the world. He himself was actually a guest on Firing Line. And I'll be very brief, but I think it's an interesting story, because it actually speaks to Buckley's willingness to hear the other side and give everyone equal oxygen in the room, in the conversation. And it's sort of the thrust of his forward. So the great journalist Seymour Hersh, had published a book on war crimes in Vietnam, in which Oliver North served. And he gives the impression in the book and on his subsequent appearance on Firing Line that war crimes were sort of part and parcel in the Vietnam War. They weren't sort of the work of a few, rebellious troops, but they were actually more codified into an actual practice. And Colonel North thought that was a bit much, and decided to complain about it to Buckley in a letter. Him and two other Marines whose names, forgive me, it just escaped me at the moment. But um, they wrote a letter to Buckley saying that they'd like to come on and give, so to speak, the other side. And Buckley invited them on. Buckley said, "Absolutely, come on." And then the good colonel goes into it goes into the happening of that in the forward. Uh, so I just thought that was a perfect way to just get him involved in the book, and I think it adds, in my opinion, a lot of credibility. And I can't help just a smidge of shameless self promotion here, where he writes that my new book is a must read for those of us who care about the future of our nation, our children, and our grandchildren. So I thought I could do worse than that. So that's
Yeah.
how he became involved, and it's an honor to have had him involved in the book in any facet.
I agree. I mean, it's phenomenal, and I wanted to ask you that. And the other thing I think is so important that for people to hear about and get I want to get your take on it as well is like the whole idea behind a guide to friendship in a polarized era. Like you had said at the beginning, William Buckley's friends came from all sides of the political spectrum, and this is another reason why I really wanted to interview you, because this is really in alignment with the work that we do at Beyond Barriers as well, and there's a lot of parallels to it. So nowadays, as you know. I mean, getting people to sit down and have conversations across, say, political divides, which is so difficult. I mean, it is. I think in our lifetimes, it's probably the worst it's ever been, at least as far as I can remember. And I come out of an extremist movement, many years ago. So
Yes.
that's pretty bad. That the society is at that level now. So I felt like this is such a timely book, and I just wanted to get some of your takes on that, and um, also and I'm going to ask two questions in one here. I can't stand it when people do that to me, but it just I'm gonna be mean and give you two of them. Also, the what how do you feel like people can get past that and make those connections now, because we're facing a society that's so ultra divided? Like what lessons can we learn from the book on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first off, let me agree with you. We absolutely live in a hyper-polarized, society. To recall something that everyone seems to know, it's an interesting thing. The one thing everyone does seem to agree on is that we're in a polarized society. It's just everyone thinks it's the other side doing it, right? Um, well, yeah, in the book, as I mentioned, I try to map out, A, can we agree that we do live in a polarized society? Seems to me that we do. But B, mapping out how we can sort of climb out of that. Um, One of the values to come to the your second question that I pull out, that I sort of try as best I can, and I hope successfully, to make sort of the building block. This is the sand before we put the cement on, the bedrock. That's the word I was looking for. Is gratitude, the value of gratitude, because it seems to me before you say that we need to save society, culture, the country, if you want to be dramatic, is we have to first agree that it's worth saving. I think it is. And the best way to instill that is to have a sense of gratitude, right? We live in a Western civilization that has its problems, sure, but is very successful and very pluralist. Whenever there's an issue, and I go into this in a book, let's say let's say civil rights, we have, so to speak, a correction mechanism built into our culture by way of self-criticism, right? By way of writing about it, playfully, ironically, sometimes seriously, certainly. Not having a sense of humor can sometimes be an important thing. Um, uh, where we recognize that fault in our society and we will take causes to fix it. Not to go down this rabbit hole too far, but if you think of, like, let's say, gay rights in America, and I can recall from my time in high school, I can recall quite vividly it being defined as an alternative lifestyle, right? I remember that vividly. Now it's anything but alternative, right? Um, so that correction mechanism spins in terms of fixing what it might view as a black spot in our culture, if that makes sense. Um, and I also go into uh, institutions as well. Our mutual, one institution that you and I both love. We don't need to talk too much about it. The SPLC, ACLU, etc. I go into in some detail about. I'm proud to say, actually, with a firm degree of a fair degree of prescience. I criticized it, and now we see it rather encumbered in controversy. Um, Let me see what else. I also go into, I think one big distortion field that makes those Thanksgiving dinners so tricky is how we're getting our information, right? And why don't we just say it? Journalism. Um, on both the right and the left. I actually take no prisoners in my argument on journalism. One thing I do want to say, I've gotten some criticism, I think somewhat fairly, but I think I do have a good retort, and I cover it towards the end of the book, that it seems that I only criticize left-leaning institutions in the book. I can, ACLU, etc. And I think it's a fair criticism, but it just happens to be the case that our institutions, including journalism, which I'll come to, have been uniquely captured by the left in a way that the right simply hasn't. Same with academia, in my opinion, right? Um, once again, I think it's a fair criticism, but I think I couldn't have done it any other way. And the point really is that they shouldn't be biased at all. I mean, I remember, journalism was supposed to be unslanted and unhindered by by conservative influences or left-wing influences. Let me see. Did I answer your question, Jeff, or did I just completely?
No, that was great. And I was going to say when news was actually news and not opinion,
Yeah,
right?
and not opinion.
That's a problem, and I agree with you. I mean, when when you have all these different news outlets and you have to and I've done this to test myself on it, because I have the ones that I like to watch and ones that I really don't like to watch, but I'll
Yeah.
purposely, do a sampling of some of them, and like I can give one example just recently where the in New York when they had the two ISIS sympathizers that threw the bomb at the protest outside of Gracie Mansion.
Yep.
There was, and I won't name them, but I know the outlet. But there was one outlet that made it sound like these guys were coming to, attack the mayor, and it wasn't the case at all. The attack was to be on the people that were out there, and the rest of the news outlets kind of covered it that way, but there was some that spun it in a different way, and I kind of forgot about it, and I was looking for something else just the other day, and I saw that pop up again. I thought, my gosh, and they still haven't corrected it. It's just out there like that. Like I thought, well, surely it'll be corrected in a week, or not always.
And the correction never happens.
No, I mean, sometimes it does, but I mean, by that point, it's kind of too late in a lot of ways. It's like, yeah, legally, you've done your due diligence now and you've corrected it, but 90% of the people that saw it maybe believe that's the real story because they're not going to go back and check the small fine print or to see if it was corrected. So,
No,
um,
exactly. And just to meet you with another news story, The Intercept, which a fairly well-known news outlet, did an article just the other day about how ICE, not ISIS, but ICE has been using supposed Nazi rhetoric in billboards, for their advertisements, which could be a story. Um, However, I couldn't help, and in their Twitter posts and so on. Now I don't quite know what Nazi rhetoric is. I could make a guess, but it seems like it's a very wide net to cast. And the thing that jumped out at me most was that nowhere in the story did it have a picture of the billboards? Did it have a post of this supposed Nazi rhetoric? If I'm an editor, I'm thinking, okay, first off, what are these posts let's see what we're dealing with before we do anything else. So the mere fact that none of it, they had all the opinions and it seems none of the facts, I think was telling in and of itself.
yeah, great example too.
Mhm. Mhm.
Now, back to your book, and do you have lessons in there specifically on how I'm thinking in the work that we do at Beyond Barriers, Daryl Davis and I engage in relational dialogue to excuse me, we engage in relational dialogue to reach people, and that's kind of the process that we use. I'm curious what lessons the public can learn from your book, and lessons in civility from William Buckley and from some of his friendships, because I mean a lot of people would think, I'm looking just from the outside looking in, and they think, oh, Buckley, he's conservative, I don't want nothing, if I'm thinking differently, I don't want to talk to him, I don't want to hear from him, all this kind of things.
Mhm.
And people on both sides do this as well, that I don't want to hear that person, that they don't matter or something. And just like the Thanksgiving Day example, like Aunt so and so or Uncle so and so voted a certain way, so now they're not welcome at the Thanksgiving table. Like that's a serious problem in this country right
Yeah.
now. And what are some key takeaways?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the one that most occurs to me as you're saying that, which I think does get at the heart of solving that Thanksgiving table problem, is staving off fanaticism. And what I mean broadly by that, and I said this on another podcast a few weeks ago, it means seeing the person you're talking to, not not simply as your intellectual foil of the moment, that they're a person that just stands, you know, there to irritate you in this one argument, in this one time in history, right? But they're in fact a fully fleshed human being with all kinds of thoughts, feelings, idiosyncrasies, perhaps hypocrisies. We are all human, etc. Um, and yeah, that's a value I pull out from probably his best liberal friend. There'd be some, you know, debate about that, but a liberal Harvard economist named J.K. Galbraith, John Kenneth Galbraith. um, Actually, one quick aside from that same chapter that I want to talk about is so Buckley. It was in 1971. He gave a speech to a conference full of judges, which was called. This one was called the Republic's Duty to Repress, and in it he quotes a SCOTUS judge, Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was the same man who conjured up the term, shouting fire in a crowded theater, etc., regarding freedom of speech. So Buckley quotes Holmes in terms of defining what a fanatic is and what a fanatic is not, and I think it's just a brilliant example. So he says that as a matter of just common sense, we can all agree that we have ownership of the space above our roof of our house, such that if we had a neighbor that constructed a perpendicular object to extend over our roof, that would be a violation. And that's a fairly easy example that we can all, I see you nodding along, right? That makes
Yep.
sense. However, the fanatical reason from that ownership above their house claims to a shaft of air that will ascend into the heavenly spheres, such to the extent that no airplane can fly through it, no child's kite might float through it. The nodding continues. And that's what the fanatic would say, right? And I think that is just a brilliant example, um, because I actually do think most, not all, but I think most people do want to gather around that table and experience their uncle from another generation who might not have updated software in terms of what words to use and what terms not to use, and just recognize that. So fanaticism is one. I think another, which is a bit less heady, but I think is still nonetheless important. I have a chapter on reclaiming our sense of humor. Um, yeah, and I reference a fairly famous controversy, though people's memories are rather short for this kind of thing, where Pete Davidson on SNL made a joke about Congressman Dan Crenshaw, the congressman that has an eye patch. I don't need to go into the full details, but basically there was controversy about it, and Crenshaw was invited on to accept a public apology, and that was that. But Crenshaw afterwards put out a tweet which I absolutely love, and he says, "Here's a good rule in life: try not to offend, but try harder not to be offended." And I love that because it does give a sort of moral impetus on everyone. Yeah, let's try not to offend. That seems good. But also, if someone says something you don't like, it also does not mean that the world has to end. So I think those two lessons in particular are probably the best prescriptions for a society, in addition to reclaiming or repatriating all these other things like journalism and colleges and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, we're at a I think a precipice in life and in our society, I should say, where, someone says, well, if someone says something I don't like, I want them canceled. I want to,
Yeah,
let's dox them, let's end their career. And then this is something you see like I and I look at X and get the news and different things like that on there, and I see it almost every single day, and it's both sides because I look, I talk to people on all the different sides as well, and there's people that say, well, this person said this, they should be canceled. Now, I mean, I think if you're advocating someone's death or something, that's a little different, but if just saying something that people disagree with or might be a controversial opinion. I mean, come on, like
Yeah.
when did that become a thing where it was like now it's such a divisive thing and I have to have my way and if you don't like it then you don't belong in society and all this craziness. When did that start, do you think?
Well, I think I can answer that in part. So just to give you another example, and I'll have an answer at the end there, I promise. But from Buckley's own lifetime, he was invited on Woody Allen's show to discuss various things. And that right there, by the way, liberal comedian, conservative commentator, just talking, joking. He was quite funny, by the way, William F. Buckley. Surprisingly so to many people that aren't me. Um, but there's one. They take audience Q&A, right? People go up to the microphone and ask their question. One exchange in particular, which I do have in the book, because I think it leads into an answer to your question. There was a young lady that approached the microphone and asked Mr. Buckley if he thought miniskirts were in good taste. Do you think miniskirts are in good taste? And he had a smile and he just said, "Well, on you, I think they are."
Yeah.
Just a light joke. Everyone laughed and everyone got on with the rest of it. But think about if that exact exchange occurred now, what might happen? I wouldn't I wouldn't put it past our society to cancel Buckley out of hand right then and there. You know, and I think finally to answer your question is I think social media has been the great engine that has sort of driven home this whole thing of nobody can be offended anywhere, and anyone that does offend should be uh, perhaps not literally put to death, though one could think of examples, but should be canceled and reprimanded in any sense. But one thing we definitely cannot do is laugh at it and then move on with our lives. And I think social media has a big plays a big, I don't think exclusive, but massive, massive role in this. I know that may be a lazy answer because that's the answer everyone gives. But one person I do want to shout out, he's not in the book, but there's a scientist, political scientist named Jonathan Haidt or Haidt. I always forget how to pronounce his name, but he's been on a very brave mission lately of trying to get cell phones, social media bans on people that are younger than it's either 16 or 18. And he's been trying his best to do this. At the very least, get it banned from schools, which I can't say I hate the idea of because anxiety, depression. I mean, all these things have absolutely skyrocketed. And one thing I'm sorry to drone on, Jeff, but one thing I seem to notice is that everyone seems to get the point about social media being a hindrance. The very most I get from people is they'll tell me it's a necessary evil, which I might agree with, particularly like you and me who have, our own platforms that we want to get up and out, right? Um, so yeah. Did I answer that question, Jeff?
Yeah, and I feel like that's the truth. I mean, as far as at least I agree with that opinion as well, is that it can be social media is like a necessary evil, but it can be good. But for me, it's almost like, yeah, I need to use it for the platform and all that kind of stuff. But it's just like, okay, I'm gonna put out this message. Wait, what if someone misunderstands that? What if it offends
Yeah.
somebody? Like these are the thought. I mean, you have to do that every single time because if you put out something that's uh I'll use an example. Like I was talking about I was using an example of leaving extremism and somehow like how former extremists a person that was involved in extremism is going to listen to a former extremist because they've had the same uh similar paths in life. And I use the example of Alcoholics Anonymous, and say like an alcoholic a doctor could get up there and tell the crowd, you know, alcohol's bad for you. This is why, and break down all the physiological reasons and everything, and just knock it out of the park. But a lot of people in the audience are going to tune it out because that doctor wasn't an alcoholic. He didn't know about that. But the alcoholic gets up there, somebody that beat alcoholism and gives a talk. Everybody in that room is tuned in because that's somebody that understands their journey. And there was one person that had come up to me and said, "You, I can't believe you would disparage alcoholics like that." And what? It was an example, you know. I was absolutely not doing that. So sometimes people can take things out of context, and it's like that's what you took away from the entire talk, was I was disparaging alcoholics. Come on, you know.
Oh, well, it's funny. Yeah, that's hilarious. And I also actually make the point in the book that in debate, discussion, point making of any flavor, you're either people are either looking to they're either on a mission to understand or they're on a mission to misunderstand. Now, in that particular instance, I don't know whoever it was that gave you that criticism, but just hearing it, it sounds like that person made something like a decision before you even told the story, right? Um, I think in general, it's easy to fairly easy to parse out what's a genuine, legitimate cause of curiosity or concern or belief or whatever, and then there are people that are just striving to paint you in the bad light and in a bad faith way, which I know you have more than a decent amount of experience at yourself. And I have too, as a Jewish conservative guy in the cities. You have not lived until you're a Jewish guy who gets called a Nazi. It's a very interesting feeling, and yes, that's happened to me. um
Let's dive into that a little bit because I
yeah.
mean that is where our society is at right now. Where that I mean I'm not saying all people are like that, but that happens. And how does as coming from your background and like how does that feel like as a and I know this might be a hard question for you, Josh, and I apologize, but how does that
No.
make you feel when people are doing that?
Well, in that particular instance, I like to think I have a fairly fine-tuned sense of irony. In that very specific case, when I'm a Jewish guy, as I am, and someone calls me a Nazi, I can only laugh. I can only laugh. The accusation is so just on its face ridiculous and laughable that that's all I can do. Um, uh, by the way, finding a sense of humor. Um, but to take it a bit more seriously, that's obviously the sure sign of someone who does not want to understand and has their own preconceived notion that the person that says that to me will not be convinced I'm anything other than a Nazi, right? Um, and there's a part of me that wants to say, well, move on from that person. That person is what shall I say, intellectually incurious, to put it very nice and very, very
That is a nice
diplomatic,
way to put it. Wow, I got to
right?
remember that. That's so nice.
You strike me as intellectually incurious. It's that'd be a good one. Yeah, I don't know. See, the thing is though, the project of being someone that doesn't throw out lazy accusations like that, and you see that all the time in society. Nazi, racist, misogynist, any kind of ist you could wish for. The project of being the sort of person that does not do that is an internal job, right? The person making those accusations needs to grow into a person who doesn't make those accusations. And you know, as far as how they might be able to help themselves do that, um, all I can say is, available on Amazon.com. William F. Buckley Jr.'s Guide to Friendship in a Polarized Era. Yeah,
There it
I'll
is.
join you.
There it is, people. All right. Excellent. So what would you say was the hardest chapter for you to write or the most challenging chapter in the book to write and why?
Ooh, that's a very interesting question. That's a very interesting question. No one's asked me that yet. Um, well, I suppose the hardest chapter, which the paradox of the writer, it was the hardest chapter, which also made it the most fun. Uh, might be my chapter on the late great Christopher Hitchens. Perhaps. I think I'll go with that. My answer might change if we do a follow-up of these, but at this moment, I think it's got to be that. So Christopher Hitchens, and for anyone who's unfamiliar, might be the most famous atheist of the 20th century. I don't think that runs the risk of being too much of an overstatement. And Buckley, which I haven't said it yet, and I'll say it now. The subtitle of the book is "Lessons in Civility from a Catholic Conservative Icon," and I go into, as you know, great depth. I have a whole chapter dedicated to his Catholicism, and I keep setting his Catholicism and his faith as sort of the North Star that he looks towards in terms of being civil and kind and the rest of it. Um, the reason he was harder to write about was because, as far as I know, and it will not surprise you to learn, I have about 30 books on Buckley behind me on my bookshelf. Um, as far as I know, of any, I'm the only writer on Buckley to go into his relationship with Christopher Hitchens at all, which is very exciting and it's a very cool thing to say. But it does mean that I didn't have too much in terms of material to dwell on. I sort of had to do a lot of original research, which it's part of the writer's deal, and that was a great fun to do. But I couldn't quite just come up with it at the tip of my fingers. I had to do some deep dives, right? Um, and perhaps just to dwell on that for a little bit, I interviewed Christopher Buckley, who's the only son of William F. Buckley, and himself a very well-known author. He wrote a book called "Thank You for Smoking," which was made into an excellent movie if you've ever seen it. Um, yeah, great movie, highly
I'll
recommend.
have to check it out.
Yeah, yeah. And he told me that Hitchens once took him aside because they were friends and said that William F. Buckley gave Hitchens his first exposure on television. And I opine in the book, the paradox, the irony of someone as pious as Buckley basically bringing the most famous atheist ever into the American consciousness. Um, and yeah, so I go into detail about the various debates they had. They were on with Peter Robinson of the Hoover Institute to discuss the 60s. They did a whole debate on, of all things, e-commerce tax when Amazon was coming up. That was a very hotly debated topic. I vaguely recall. And then what Hitchens thought of Buckley. Hitchens thought a lot about Buckley, was very positive in writing about him. Now, anyone that knows anything about Christopher Hitchens knows that Hitchens was not nice about anybody. So the fact that he was says a lot. Um, and I might, if you don't mind me answering a question that you haven't asked, but it just kind of occurs to me now. I'd love
Please.
to dwell on it if that's okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So I was asked a while back, was there anyone who I wanted to write about and include that for whatever reason I couldn't include or it didn't make sense to include? And the answer is yes. So we'll move from the atheist to another God lover. There's a man named Malcolm Muggeridge, who was a well-known journalist and humorist, who was a very devout Catholic. And my favorite thing to point out about him is he's the reason why you, me, and everyone that's going to listen to this knows the name Mother Teresa. Yeah,
Wow.
because yeah, and the reason is what propelled Mother Teresa to fame was there was a documentary that was done on her. Uh, and there was this idea, whether you believe it or not, that some of the film that included her was especially bright, that it may have been given some sort of divine presence. Uh, well, Malcolm Muggeridge was the producer of that documentary, and so that's what catapulted Mother Teresa, Agnes Borgiaschi was her given name, to that level. Um, and the reason I didn't include him, though I would have liked to, was because I had already at that point covered several atheist liberals, and I wanted to keep that theme going because, after all, the whole thing is how do we talk to people we disagree with? So I didn't actually want too many fellow travelers in the book. if the book becomes massively successful and my publisher asks me to type up a second edition, I'll be sure to include him. Um, and there was another person, a prominent gay conservative activist. When's the last time you heard those words strung together? Named Marvin named Marvin Liebman, um, who was friends with Buckley for decades and considered Buckley a mentor. In fact, I found out later. This is one of the wonderful things about doing a book, by the way, is after it's published, as you might know, you're suddenly struck by all the things that you should have included, but
Yeah.
you didn't consider it. You know the feeling.
Yep.
uh, um, but Liebman actually came out in an article in National Review to his conservative brethren. Yeah,
Wow.
and that yeah, yep. So that meant that he had the permission of Buckley. Buckley assisted in it. I've never, whatever the experience of coming out is, this was at a time when it was, a real step of bravery. Not to say it's not now, but I don't think anyone would disagree that we haven't become a great deal more tolerant of that sort of thing. Um, and yeah, so I think if I ever do type up a second edition, I'm going to have to include those two. Certainly Liebman, because I think that's a fascinating story.
What year was that? That because you're right, it was a lot more controversial to for a gay person to come out with that back in those days. What do you know what year that was or approximately timeline? Are we talking 80s or
I I Gosh, I hope I'm right. I think it was in the 80s. In any event, I know it was before the great revolution of our cultural embrace of homosexuality, where we stopped calling it alternative lifestyles and legalized the marriage and so on and so forth, and seeing will and grace, so on. Seeing it in the culture. It was still quite taboo at the time. So it's a step of bravery, both for Liebman, but also for Buckley, because keep in mind his audience, right? Catholic,
right?
well, conservative, but certainly Catholic. But Buckley was also someone who, I even say this in the book, spoke the truth in his heart. Uh, he wrote very critically of other supposedly conservative institutions, like the JBS, the John Birch Society, which was a fanatic, going back to the fanaticism, a fanatic conservative group that basically accused everyone of being a communist, including Eisenhower. Um, and then populism, he railed against. There was a governor named an Alabama governor named George Wallace, who, to keep a long story short, which I think is too late, was relied very much on populism. He was much more of a New Dealer in terms of his actual uh, conservatism, which was something that Buckley criticized a lot. So, in addition to all those things, he also spoke, what he felt was true to himself, and was not what you might call an ideologue, right? Or a what's the word? Lockstep conservative. I love
Excellent.
floundering and being all over the place for you. I love just
No, you throw a lot of big names there though, because I'm sure, hopefully, most of the people know who George Wallace is and some of these other names. This is some controversial figures throughout history,
yes.
and it's pretty incredible. I'd say like one of the things that I like most about the book too is that it's encouraging people to come together, even though we do have these differences. And I think even now, it seems more extreme than in the past, like the differences that people have and the reasons why people won't talk to each other and lessons that we can take from that. And I guess and I'll start with this, but I want to ask, in your own life, I'll say in my experience, coming out of a extremist movement and things like that, um, a lot of people that were involved in that stuff, their parents, their families cut them off. They become very, very isolated, and in that case, in our family, we kept it. Where we wouldn't discuss politics. That's why we were able to hold the family together. So I was going to ask, in your life and your experience, what things have you done to be able to overcome polarization and things of that nature? What examples could you give us that would draw back to the book as well? Oh,
Hey, long time no see.
all right. Well, we lost you there for a minute.
I'm gonna guess you have a trial version of Zoom, right?
No, no, we shouldn't.
No? Oh,
Let me see. It says, oh, it must have shut off because it says record, pause recording. No, it's still recording. Still recording.
what?
Where do we okay, let's just keep going where we left off. Um my question, I'll repeat the question. So my question was is what lessons can we take forward from the book, and like what lessons in your own life, have you used to overcome polarization? And I was explaining, as before we had the technical outage here, I was explaining some of how we had went through that in our family growing up. And basically it was in our family we didn't talk about politics. That was the let's not talk about politics and we can still be a family, and that was how we held it together. So I was going to ask, what was one of the strongest lessons from the book also, and how do you in your own life and conquer those thresholds?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it would not be a podcast if there wasn't at least one technical glitch. So I appreciate you throwing that one in now. So um in terms of how I've personally tried my best to conquer polarization just in my personal life, I think I mentioned it before I did. A sense of humor actually goes a long way just in personal interactions. Someone calls me a Nazi. I'm like, well, I'm a pretty poor one because I got synagogue on Sunday, or was that was kind of one of my go-tos. Um, yeah. So in my personal life, sense of humor goes a long way. As it happens, I come from a fairly Christian conservative family. Um, but my family is sort of a smattering. Just to go into my personal family for a minute, I have everyone from Reaganite, MAGA, you know, uh, conservatives of that ilk, and then I have lefty Marxist people on the other end. So in my personal,
I'm sorry for that.
yeah, well, yeah, it's interesting, but the thing is, I think in my family we value conversation a lot. Um, it's not a question of let's get the person to agree with me. Though I think part of that's baked into the project of talking, but it's really more like let's just hear each other out and just see what we can learn and do. I make the point in the book that, and I've said it in a few podcasts now, that in a country of over 300 million people, I think we're around 330 million. it's not it's not wise, it's not realistic to expect our society not to be polarized, right? It's a big world with lots of different people that think very different ways and vote for any number of reasons, right? And then of course you have the dreaded single issue voter, about whom it could be anyone, but as long as they agree on that one thing, you have their vote. um so I point out in the book that disagreement is not the problem. Yeah, it's disagreeability that's the problem. And I think I actually do mention in the book that you hinted at there a minute ago, Jeff, that let's just not discuss politics. I think what also was tacked on to that generally was let's not discuss politics or religion. Um, which I would have no problem getting back to. I think that's better than the society we're living in now. But ideally, I hope not. It's not utopian to think this, but ideally, I would love for us to be able to just vent out all of our beliefs and ideals and so on without pissing each other off. They're just words. They're just words. I think a lot of the intellectual and moral confusion that creeps in is when people will say things like silence is violence. Um, if I want to sound partisan about it, you know, I won't tell you what side of the political aisle says this, but I'll bet you and listeners can guess. When someone tells me that silence is violence, but rioting and looting aren't, to to me
Right.
there's not real intellectual orientation there. That we don't know which way is up in terms of our moral standing, if that makes sense.
Right.
And I
Nope.
cover that,
That doesn't.
yeah, and I cover that in the book. I'm against violence, and I don't care who knows it, but I do know what violence is. And I do know saying something that someone doesn't like isn't violence.
Correct. Correct.
So voila.
Yeah, I mean that's what makes America great too, I think, is that we have the ability to have all these opinions. It's not like in certain countries where if you criticize the leadership or something like that, you can get thrown in jail or in a camp or all kinds of things. We have these freedoms and we should love, embrace, and respect those freedoms. And you don't have to agree with everybody. How boring would the world be if we were all the same? We were all robotic automatons, where everybody thinks the same way, looks the same way. How boring, you know?
Well, actually, yeah, and actually, I don't mean to cut you off there, Jeff, but I just have a great example here. A few years back, I interviewed someone who will probably be known to some of our listeners, Sebastian Gorka. Yeah,
I'm
and
familiar.
we talked. Yes, yes, and we talked a bit about divisiveness. Um, and what did I say? What he told me was yeah, we need divisiveness because one place where there's absolutely no divisiveness whatsoever, North Korea.
I,
One
I was
thing, one
thinking
thing
about
there's
North
not is
Korea
political
when I made that
divisiveness.
point. That's great. That's great. That's perfect. Because that's exactly what I was thinking. I was like, you know what? I'm not going to name North Korea. I'm just not going to say it. But that's who was on my mind when I was making that statement because that is one. It's not the only place, but he's right. I mean, that is one of those places where you don't have those freedoms, and that's the alternative to what that could be the alternative. Some people might like that, but I sure, as an
Hmm,
American, I sure don't. you know
same here.
yeah, I like the freedom of speech. All right, in closing, I want to, if there's, is there anything that I didn't ask you or anything that you'd like to share with the listeners? I want to encourage everybody to go out and get this book, um, William F. Buckley's Guide to Friendship in a Polarized Era: Lessons in Civility from a Catholic Conservative Icon by Josh Cohen. It's a great book. It's very, very timely, and I guess that goes to you now, Josh.
Well, and I'm sure you'd agree it's very reasonably priced, and it would be the perfect summer gift for. I only have to be a shameless self promoter once, right?
Right.
Um, no, well, it's first off, it's great to talk with you, man, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity, and if for no other reason than just to see your face for a little bit. Um, yeah, the book, all kidding aside, is available wherever books are sold online, Amazon.com, probably most prominently. It's also available. My publisher, Fidelis Publishing, has its own online bookstore called faithfultext.com. And if people want to go to that, there's a coupon code they can use to get a discount on the book as well. And then in terms of anything you didn't ask, I sort of feel like we cover the waterfront pretty well. I think I'm extremely proud of this book. It's a dream come true for me. It's something I've quite literally been wanting to write about for most of my adult life, and my whole dream for my entire life has been to publish a book, and to do it with a real publisher, with a forward by Oliver North, and to be able to do things like this, to talk about it and do a bit of a dog and pony show up with a smile and a shoe shine in service to to getting people to buy the thing, has been a dream come true, and I appreciate you having me on to ventilate my dream.